At 41, Adeline Marsh had exactly $4 folded into the toe of her boot and not a single roof in the world that would take her in. She had been a wife, and then a widow, and then, in the span of one gray October morning in the year 1893, she had become nothing at all in the eyes of the men who kept the ledgers of Coldwater Bend, Wyoming. It was Harlan Voss, president of the Stockmen's Trust and holder of every mortgage worth holding for 60 miles, who signed the paper that put her off the homestead she and her husband had broken with their own hands. He did it kindly, he said, the way a man puts down a lame horse, and he did it because the panic had emptied his vaults, and he meant to fill them again from whatever was left of the small and the grieving. So Adeline walked into the rail yard at the edge of town with $4 in a carpet bag, and there, on a dead siding where the weeds had grown up through the ties, she gave every cent she owned to a board yard agent for a locked railroad car that no key in the county could open, and no man had entered in years. The whole town laughed. $4 for a rusted iron coffin, they said, from a woman too foolish to know she'd been robbed. But sealed behind that door was something that had been waiting a very long time in the dark, something that would not only lift Adeline Marsh out of the dust, but lift a whole dying town along with her. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Marsh. And if you were watching tonight from some quiet place the world seems to have forgotten, some town the trains no longer stop for, tell us in the comments where you're from, because this story was made for you. To understand a woman who would spend her last $4 on a locked door, you have to go back to the beginning of her, to the sod house on the Nebraska line where she was born. The middle daughter of a Danish blacksmith named Eric Halverson and a seamstress named Ruth who could make a flour sack look like Sunday. There was never money in that house, but there was never idleness either. And Adeline learned before she was 10 that the difference between poverty and ruin is only the willingness to look hard at a broken thing and ask what it still wants to be. Her father taught her the forge, which was not a thing fathers taught daughters. But Eric had no sons and too much work, and so Adeline grew up with soot in the creases of her knuckles and the particular patience of a person who has learned to heat iron slowly so it will not crack. She could mend a wagon tire, reset a hinge, and read the sickness in a piece of metal the way other women read the weather. From her mother, she learned the quieter arts, the turning of collars and the saving of buttons, the way you keep a household alive on nothing but attention and thrift. Ruth used to say that God made very few truly worthless things, that most of what people threw away was only tired, and that a patient woman could be a kind of resurrection for objects other folks had given up on. Adeline believed her. She believed her all her life. She married late, by the standards of the plains, at the age of 26, to a soft-spoken Welshman named Thomas Marsh, who had come west with a wagon full of tools and a head full of orchards. Thomas was a dreamer, but he was the good kind, the kind whose dreams got hitched to labor, and together they filed on a quarter section along the creek that gave Coldwater Bend its name. They had no children, though not for want of hoping, and perhaps that absence bound them closer, for they became to each other a whole company of two. Thomas planted apple whips that everyone said would never survive the Wyoming wind, and Adeline built the windbreaks that let them. And within a few years there were rows of trees leafing green against the brown hills, and travelers on the county road would slow their horses just to look. She kept the books and the forge and the garden. He kept the trees and the bees and the long view. They were not rich, but they were solvent, and in that country solvency was very nearly the same thing as royalty. On summer evenings, they would sit on the porch step and Thomas would read aloud from whatever came in the mail, and Adeline would mend by the last of the light, and she thought, without ever quite saying it, that she had been handed the one life she wanted. What she carried out of those years, more than the skills of her hands, was a way of seeing. She had learned from her father to look at the discarded thing and see the use still sleeping in it, and from her mother to believe that value hides most often in what has been overlooked, and from Thomas to trust that patience planted now will bear fruit long after the planter has stopped expecting it. These were not sentiments to her. They were tools, as real as the hammer and the pruning knife, and she would need every one of them, because the life she thought she had been handed was about to be taken back with both hands. The taking began with the water, as ruin in that country so often did. There had been 3 dry years in a row, and the creek that fed the orchard and the town alike had thinned to a brown thread, and the men who held the upstream land began to fight over what was left of it. Then came the winter that killed the cattle in windrows against the fences, and behind that the summer of the Great Panic, when the banks back east shut their doors and the money simply stopped, the way a heart stops, all at once and everywhere. Thomas took a fever that spring, a small thing at first, a cough he waved away because there was too much to do, and by the time Adeline understood that it was not a small thing, it had gone down into his chest and would not come out. She sat with him 11 nights. She did everything her mother's remedies and the town doctor could think to do. On the 12th morning, with the apple trees in full and heedless blossom outside the window, Thomas Marsh went quiet in her arms and did not come back, and the whole company of two became a company of one. She grieved, but she did not fall, because falling was a luxury, and she had a farm to hold. What she had not reckoned on was Harlan Voss. The mortgage on the homestead had a note that came due that autumn, a note Thomas had taken to buy the last parcel of orchard ground, and in ordinary times Voss would have rolled it over without a thought, the way bankers did for solvent neighbors. But these were not ordinary times, and Voss had made a private study of exactly which of his neighbors had land worth more than their debt and grief enough to be moved off it quietly. Adeline's quarter section sat on the best water left in the valley. He wanted the water, and so he called the note, all of it, at once, knowing there was not a bank between Cheyenne and the Divide that would lend a widow $1 in the middle of a panic. She pleaded her case in his office with the ledgers open between them like a river she could not cross. She offered him the orchard's yield, the forge work, anything. He folded his soft white hands and told her that business was business, and that a woman alone had no place trying to hold a working farm, and that he was in truth doing her a kindness by freeing her of it. The auction took 3 minutes. Voss bought the homestead himself through a straw man for a fraction of its worth, and by law, Adeline was permitted to keep her personal effects and nothing more. She watched strangers lead away the milk cow and the good mare. She watched a hired man she had once fed at her own table pry the copper from her mother's washing kettle. She walked out of the only home she had made in this life with a carpet bag, a change of clothes, her father's smallest hammer wrapped in a shirt, and $4 silver that Thomas had hidden years before in a jar behind the stove against exactly such a day. $4 that were now, in the most literal sense, everything she had in the world. She spent that first night in the loft of the livery on the charity of a stableman who had known Thomas, and she lay awake listening to the horses shift below her and did the only arithmetic that mattered, which was this: $4, no land, no tools, no name that any bank would honor, and a town that had already begun to look through her the way you look through a window at weather you're glad to be inside from. By dawn, she had decided that she would not leave Coldwater Bend a beggar, though she did not yet know how a person managed that. She only knew she would not go down. Her mother's voice was in her ear, steady as a forge bellows. Very few things are truly worthless, Adeline. Most of what they throw away is only tired. The rail yard sat at the low end of town, where the spur line from the main road came in and mostly stopped coming. It had been busy once, in the years when Coldwater Bend fancied itself a shipping point for cattle and fruit. But the panic had strangled the traffic, and now the sidings were half abandoned. Hospitals for the rolling stock nobody wanted. Adeline went there on her second morning because the stableman had mentioned, half in jest, that the railroad was selling off dead cars for scrap and salvage to anyone fool enough to haul them, and some stubborn instinct in her, some habit of her father's eye, made her want to look at what other people had already decided was garbage. The yard agent was a heavy, indifferent man named Pruett, who did not bother to stand when she came into the shack. She asked him what he had. He waved a hand at the yard and told her to take her pick of the wrecks, that most were only good for the iron in them. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned the locked one. It stood alone on the farthest siding, a dark and heavy car of an old and unfamiliar make, its once fine paint gone to the color of dried blood, its windows shuttered from the inside with iron plates. It was not a boxcar, and not quite a passenger coach. It had the long, low lines of something that had once been private and proud. Pruett told her its story with the boredom of a man reciting a thing he no longer believed was interesting. It had come in on a through train years ago, before his time, consigned to a siding for reasons nobody had written down, and the man it belonged to had died somewhere far away before he could claim it, and no key had ever come with it, and no locksmith in the county had ever managed the great, strange lock on its door. The railroad had tried once to cut into it and given up when the tools broke, and after that it had simply sat. A mystery nobody had the patience or the profit to solve until it became part of the landscape, a thing the eye slid over. $4, Pruitt said. And it was hers, car and contents and every headache that came with it, sold as it sat. No key, no promises, no refunds. He plainly expected her to laugh and leave. She did not laugh. She walked out across the weed-grown ties in the cold morning light and put her hand flat against the iron flank of the car, and she felt, the way she had learned to feel the sickness in a piece of metal at her father's forge, that this was not junk. Junk has a slackness to it, a giving up. This car stood square on its trucks and held its lines. Somebody had built it to last and built it to matter. And somebody had sealed it with care, and things that are sealed with care are almost never empty. She thought of her $4. She thought of the fact that they would buy her, at most, 2 weeks of the cheapest room in town, after which she would be exactly as ruined as she was now, only with nothing left to gamble. And she thought of her mother, and of the resurrection of tired things, and she went back into the shack and counted $4 silver onto Pruitt's greasy desk before she could talk herself out of it. He wrote her a bill of sale on the back of a freight manifest, snorting, and told her the yard would give her 30 days to move it before they charged her rent on the siding, and that was that. Adeline Marsh, who at dawn had owned $4 and nothing else, now owned no dollars and a locked iron car that no one on earth could open. It took her the better part of 3 days to open it, and she did it not with force but with the forge. She would not cut the car. Cutting it felt like a violence against whatever had been trusted to it. Instead, she studied the lock, which was no ordinary lock but a heavy brass mechanism of foreign manufacture, cast with a maker's mark she did not know, and she understood after a long day of looking that it had not so much been locked as sealed, that the works inside had corroded and swollen and fused, and that what it needed was not to be broken, but to be gently and patiently persuaded. She borrowed time at the livery forge in exchange for mending the stableman's tools. She heated a set of thin picks and probes of her own making. She worked the lock the way you work, rusted iron, with warmth and oil and small, unhurried pressure, coaxing where a stronger person would have wrenched. On the third evening, alone in the failing light with the whole indifferent town at supper, she felt the mechanism give, not with a snap but with a long, slow sigh, as if the car itself had been holding its breath for years and had finally decided to let it out. The great door swung inward on hinges that shrieked and then went quiet. A breath of trapped air rolled out over her, dry and strange, smelling of cedar and old paper and something faintly sweet, and Adeline Marsh stepped up into the dark to see what $4 had bought her. At first, she could see almost nothing, only shapes, and she lit the stub of candle she had brought and held it high, and the little flame woke the room in pieces. It was not a boxcar's hollow shell. It was a room, a beautiful room, a private car fitted out for a life. There were shelves along both walls, floor to ceiling, and the shelves were full of books, hundreds of them, their spines dark and gold in the candlelight. There was a desk of good wood bolted to the floor, and a berth made up with linens gone gray with dust, and a small iron stove, and a cabinet of instruments she did not yet understand. And there was a smell of preservation, of a place sealed so well and so long that time had nearly stopped inside it, so that when she ran her finger along the desk, it came away dusty but the wood beneath shone. And when she opened the nearest book, the pages were crisp and whole. Whatever was in this car had not rotted. It had not been ransacked, had not been touched, had not been so much as breathed upon by the world outside in all the years it sat unopened on that dead siding. It had simply waited, perfect and patient, for someone with the patience to reach it. And on the desk, weighted beneath a smooth river stone as though the man who left it had known someone would one day come, lay a single envelope, yellowed but sealed, addressed in a strong slanting hand to no name at all, only 2 words, "To whoever opens." She sat down in the dead man's chair, and she read the letter by candlelight, and it changed the shape of everything she thought she knew. The car had belonged to a man named Ambrose Kell, and if that name meant nothing to Adeline, it had meant a great deal to the men who built the Western railroads, for Kell had been one of them, an engineer and then a director, a man who had grown wealthy laying track across a country that did not want to be crossed. But the letter was not the letter of a rich man boasting. It was the letter of a man taking account of his life near the end of it and finding the account short. Kell wrote that he had spent 40 years building roads that made other men rich and left the small towns along them poorer than before, towns the railroad squeezed for its freight rates and then abandoned when the traffic moved on. He wrote that he had watched Coldwater Bend, in particular from his passing car, had seen its orchards and its hopeful little main street, and had learned, through the quiet inquiries a dying man has time to make, that the whole valley was about to be strangled by a scheme to seize its water. And he wrote that he had decided, too late to do it in person, to make what amends one man could. He had fitted this car as the seed of a gift. And then the letter told her plainly what the car contained, and Adeline read it twice to be sure her grief and hope were not inventing it. And then she sat very still in the dark and understood that her whole life had been, without her knowing, a training for this exact and impossible morning. The books were the least of it, though the books alone were a treasure. A whole lending library, medical texts and agricultural manuals and law books and literature, chosen, Kell wrote, so that a forgotten town might educate its own children and doctor its own sick and argue its own rights without begging the mercy of the men who had abandoned it. The cabinet of instruments was a complete kit for a country physician, sealed against decay, worth more than the town's doctor had seen in a decade. In a strong box bolted beneath the berth, Kell wrote, she would find gold coin, not a fortune to a railroad man, but a fortune to a town like this, enough to seed a mutual fund that could lend to farmers when no bank would. But the true heart of the gift was in a flat iron document case behind the false back of the desk, and when Adeline found the catch and opened it, her hands began to shake. There were deeds. Ambrose Kell, in his last years, using agents who did not know for whom they worked, had quietly bought up the water rights to the headwaters of Coldwater Creek, the very rights that Harlan Voss had spent 3 years and a dozen ruined families trying to corner for himself. Kell had bought them first. He had held them. And in the document case, drawn up and witnessed and legal in every particular, was a deed of trust granting those water rights, in perpetuity, not to any man but to the people of Coldwater Bend in common, to be administered by the town for the good of all its farms. The water Voss was killing them to steal had belonged to the town all along. It had been sitting in a locked car on a dead siding for years, 400 feet from his bank, while he strangled his neighbors to get it, and now it belonged to a widow he had cast out, with $4 in her boot. Adeline told no one for 3 days. She needed those 3 days to be certain, and to be careful, because she understood better than most what happens to a poor woman who walks into a bank waving papers that make a powerful man a thief. She read the deed of trust until she could recite it. She read the law books until she understood exactly what it meant. She found the strong box and the gold, and did not touch a coin of it. She sat with the enormity of what she held, and she thought not once of taking it for herself, though she could have. She could have sold the water rights to Voss himself for enough to live like a queen the rest of her days, and no one would ever have known, and she would have been a rich woman by nightfall. But her mother's voice was steady in her, and Thomas's long, patient view was steady in her, and the letter of a dying stranger who had spent his fortune trying to undo his life's harm was steady in her, and she knew that Ambrose Kell had not sealed his life's amends in an iron car for 40 years, so that one more clever person could turn it to private gain. He had left it to whoever opens, because he trusted that the kind of person patient enough to open a thing everyone else had given up on would also be the kind of person patient enough to do right with it. She would not make a liar of a dead man's faith, but knowing the right thing and being permitted to do it are two different countries, and the border between them was Harlan Voss. Word had begun to travel, as word does, that the Marsh widow had gotten the old car open and found something inside, and Voss was not a man who let mysteries sit near his bank. He came to her himself on the 4th morning, walking out across the weed-grown ties in his good coat with 2 men behind him, and he stood at the foot of the car and smiled up at her in the doorway and offered, with great warmth, to buy the whole thing from her, car and contents unseen, for $100, cash, on the spot. It was a staggering sum to a woman who had owned $4 a week before, and he watched her face to see it land. When it did not land the way he expected, When she only looked at him with her father's steady iron-reading eyes and said she would think on it, his smile thinned. He raised the offer to 200. He explained gently that a car full of a dead man's junk was worth nothing to a woman with no way to move it, and that the yard would soon be charging her rent she could not pay, and that he was, once again, doing her a kindness. And Adeline understood, watching him, that he did not yet know exactly what was in the car, only that a lifetime of instinct told him it was something he needed to own before anyone else opened it. She thanked him for his kindness and closed the great door in his face, and she heard, through the iron, the sound of a powerful man discovering that his money had stopped working. He did not stay gentle long. When Voss could not buy the car, he set out to take it, and he had the tools to do it, for a bank president in a small town holds more than money. Within 2 days, a notice appeared, over Pruitt's reluctant signature, that the siding rent was now due immediately and in full, a sum designed to be impossible, and that failing payment, the car and its contents would be seized and sold to satisfy the debt. With the buyer, everyone understood, already chosen. When Adeline went to the county land office to record even a copy of the deed of trust and put it beyond his reach, she found the clerk suddenly, apologetically unable to find the book she needed on Voss's word. He was closing every door he owned, and he owned most of them. And Adeline saw with terrible clarity that if she moved slowly and correctly, the way a poor person is always told to move, he would simply outwait and outspend her, seize the car for pennies, quietly burn the deed of trust that named him a thief, and take the water after all. The law was a door, and the town's most powerful man was standing in it. She had opened one impossible lock with patience and warmth. This one was going to take something else. What she had, that Voss did not reckon on, was the town itself, the very people he had spent 3 years grinding down. Adeline could not fight him with money or with the county offices he controlled, but she could do the one thing he had never bothered to do in all his years of ruling Coldwater Bend. She could tell the people the truth, all of it, at once, out loud, where he could not quietly make it disappear. And so on the last evening before the seizure, she did not go to the land office or the bank. She went to the church, which was the one large room in town that Voss did not own, and she asked the minister, who had buried Thomas and half the valley's dead, for the use of it, and she sent word by every child and gossip and friendly stableman she knew that the Marsh widow had something to say about the water, and that anyone who had lost a farm or feared to should come and hear it. They came. They filled the pews and stood along the walls. Farmers and their wives and the doctor and the school teacher and the men who had led away her cow, come out of guilt or curiosity, and Harlan Voss came too, near the back, with his arms folded, because a man like Voss cannot bear not to be in the room where he is being discussed. And Adeline Marsh, who had buried her husband and lost her land and spent her last $4 on a locked door, stood up in front of the whole town and did not raise her voice. She simply read them the letter of Ambrose Kell.
She read them the deed of trust. She held up the water rights that belonged to every soul in that room, and she told them, in plain words, who had spent 3 years trying to steal them, and that he was standing at the back of the church. She had thought, in the worst of her fear, that they might not believe her, that Voss's power was so total the truth would simply slide off it. But she had underestimated what it does to people to be handed, all at once, the proof of a thing they had felt in their bones for years, without being able to name. The room did not roar. It did something quieter and more final than roaring. It turned, pew by pew, and looked at Harlan Voss. And in that turning, he saw the one thing his money had never been able to buy him and could never buy back, which was the good regard of his neighbors. There was no mob and no violence. For this is not a story of violence. There was only a room full of people who now knew exactly what he was, and a set of documents, witnessed and legal, that were now known to exist by 200 witnesses and could no longer be made to quietly disappear. The doctor, who had a cousin who was a circuit judge and no love left for Voss, offered on the spot to carry a certified copy of the deed to the district court himself. The school teacher offered to catalog the library. The minister offered the church cellar to store the strongbox until the town could vote a trustee, and Voss, who understood ruin better than any man there because he had dealt so much of it, did the arithmetic of his own position in about the time it takes a lock to pry open, and he turned and walked out of the church into the dark, and within the month he had sold his interest in the bank and left Coldwater Bend, and no one there ever heard him spoken well of again. He did not go to prison. The law moved slowly, and his lawyers moved cleverly, and there was no true justice in a cell for him. But he lost the thing he had traded his whole life to gather, which was the power to make a town afraid of him. And he lost it in front of that town, and in a place as small as Coldwater Bend. That is a harder sentence than a jail. What Adeline did next, she did exactly as Ambrose Kell had hoped, and exactly as her mother would have understood. She kept not one coin and not one water right for herself. She stood before the town and gave it all away into their common keeping, the deed of trust to the water recorded at last in the county book, the gold set up as a mutual lending fund, so that no farmer in that valley would ever again have to beg a Harlan Voss for the money to make it through a dry year. The physician's kit given to the doctor, the great library open to every child and grown soul who wanted it. The car itself she would not sell for scrap. They moved it, with 40 men and a borrowed engine, off the dead siding and onto a spur beside the church. And they made it what Kell had dreamed it might be, a lending library, and a schoolroom, and a doctor's office, all in one long, beautiful room. And the children of Coldwater Bend learned their letters in the same car that had held the water that saved their father's farms. The orchards came back because the water came back. And Thomas's apple trees, which Voss had let go dry, were bought back into the town's common ground by the fund and pruned into bearing again. And the town, which the railroad had built and abandoned and which the panic had nearly killed, did not die. It held. It held because a woman with $4 had looked at a thing everyone else had written off and been patient enough to ask what it still wanted to be. They tried to give her things, of course. They tried to give her the run of the fund, and a house, and the honor of being called the town's benefactor. And she took almost none of it, only a small set of rooms behind the library car where she could keep the forge going and the books dusted. What she took instead was the work. She became the keeper of Kell's car, the woman who checked out the books and stoked the little iron stove for the schoolchildren in winter and mended, with her father's smallest hammer, every tired and broken thing the town brought her, because that, it turned out, was the life she had been training for all along. The resurrection of things other people had given up on. She was not rich when she died, many years later, an old woman asleep in the berth of the car she had bought for $4. But there was not a farm in that valley that did not owe its water to her patience, nor a child grown who had not learned to read in her care. And when they buried her beside Thomas in the orchard ground they had bought back, the whole town came, and no one there thought she had died poor.
Think back now to where we began, to a woman of 41 with $4 folded in the toe of her boot and nowhere in the world to sleep, cast out by a banker who thought grief made her easy to rob, laughed at by a whole town for spending everything she owned on a locked iron car that no one could open. Every single thing they said about her that morning was true, and every single thing they meant by it was wrong. She was foolish, if patience is foolishness. She was ruined, if a person who has lost her land and kept her mother's faith is ruined. And what was sealed behind that door truly did change her life and lift a dying town along with her, exactly as we promised, but not in the way that money changes a life, for she gave the money away. What changed was that a woman who had been told she was worthless spent her last $4 insisting that worth hides most often in what the world has thrown away, and she turned out to be right about the car, and right about the town, and right about herself. That was the whole secret of Adeline Marsh. She could see the value in a thing that everyone else had already decided to abandon, because she had learned the hardest way there is exactly what that felt like from the inside. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end of this one. It means more than you know that you spent this quiet half hour here with us. If Adeline's story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that the thing they've been written off for might be the very thing that saves them. And tell us in the comments the answer to just one question tonight, the question this whole story was really about. When was there a time in your own life that you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? We read every one of them, and we carry them with us into the next story. Until then, be patient with the tired and broken things. Be patient with yourself, and know that a great deal of what looks like ruin is only waiting for the right pair of hands. From all of us, thank you, good night, and until next time, stay close.